So I'm really, really happy to have such an amazing panel here today. I think, on a personal level, like it was really hard in our community even, and we're not very many people, and we are quite well coordinated, and there's a ton of trust to actively and to accurately try to make sense of this crisis, right? Because I think a few people are exposed to ideas before. They then kind of update on what they're supposed to do. Then they maybe share that information. But then if others don't update in the same way, they don't really know, is it because they don't have the right, the same access to the same data that I do, or is it that they do, but they don't take it as seriously? So we, even in our local community where we live together and where, we're very close together, it was kind of this time-lagged game of trying to make sense of it, because others updated earlier, then information trickled through, then others updated a little later. At that point, the people that had updated earlier were, now we lost that much time. So it was like this crazy coordination game that was going on, I think. So communication, I think, is a type of coordination game. And so I think getting everyone up to speed and realizing that, even in a small community, that's really hard to do, made me have a lot of appreciation for even the effort at all for trying to do that nationally and globally. And I think, we're hopefully going to talk a lot about tools, specific tools that may help us to do that, to get better at sense making, and then tools about how we can communicate that information effectively. Because I think that, that is the first step to reaching any good action. So I definitely, even from yesterday, I don't know if everyone read the follow-up from yesterday, but basically yesterday we talked about how can communities emerge stronger as a engine for change. And one thing that was mentioned that failed on a national level was not only the specific idiosyncrasies of the US government, but generally in many Western European liberal democracies also struggled with this lack of trust between the technocrats and the policymakers. And there was a similar coordination game going on a national level where, the technocrats may have packaged information in different ways because they thought that it would allow policymakers to make decisions in certain ways, and policymakers got distrustful of the packaging, and it was this weird spiral, how Glenn Whale called it yesterday, that was unfolding, where there was really lack of trust. So I think that problem of communication, integration, and overcoming this divide was mentioned yesterday as one of the main trigger point to get right, if we want to have good coordinated responses. So I'm really happy that that laid the groundwork so well for talking about that problem today. And I couldn't imagine better people to talk about this issue with than our current panel. If you're not on Slack yet, I strongly recommend you go on Slack, because this is where the panel is introducing themselves in the introductions, and this is where I think Kim already started answering some questions. So I basically posted all of the questions that I'm hoping to get through today, and maybe even just a small subset, on Slack. And so if you join Slack Hive week 3 discussion, then you can right now, during this conversation, upvote questions that you really, really want me to ask. You can add your own questions that then can be upvoted, and so to make sure that they're being heard. And please answer the questions that I'm asking. We're hoping to hear from all of you, right? This is only 1 hour, and we have barely enough time to hear from the great panel and get your questions in, but I would really love to hear from most of you, because if there's one thing that I saw is that during this crisis, we saw so many incredible new modeling tools and new simulation efforts arising that are all trying to help with sense making, that I'm sure you're all working on a piece of the puzzle, and I don't even know. So please share the different puzzle pieces that you're working on. There's a specific question that asks about new tools that people are developing. So please share that with us. We're hoping to create a little bit of a map of all of the tools that people are working on. Okay, great. So let's start into today's panel. I'm super happy to have Anthony Aguirre, Aviv Ovadya, Kim Osborne, and Phoebe Tickell here on the call today. So Anthony is one of the co-founders of the Future of Life Institute, has also launched this fantastic project, Metaculus, which even before the pandemic became kind of like the main sense-making tool for many people in the, like, let's say, more rationalist community. And they were actually able, I think Anthony told us at the last salon, because he had a foresight salon on Metaculus before, and he told us actually that he got wary that something may be happening because someone on Metaculus predicted, I think very early, maybe in February or January, for the first time, I think that the global world population wouldn't be increasing. So that was the first time when he updated. So clearly that tool was a very first kind of like trigger to make sense of the situation much earlier. So it would be cool to talk about, different ways in which we can kind of use it as a coordination tool. Then we have Aviv Ovadya of the Thoughtful Technology Project here. And Aviv has been working kind of like vicariously on trying to combat not only deepfakes, but generally fake news efforts over the past few years, and really has, I think, been termed the one of the consciousness of Silicon Valley in that new field of specifically trying to make sense of those new deepfake strategies. And we've been collaborating with him on a foresight project before, and I think he's just really quite a fantastic being in the way that he shows up quite authentically with the launch of COVID-19. He set up a really great actually Facebook group, which a lot of us are a member of, and is just stewarding this community really well, and it's helped me tremendously on about making sense of this project. And many people who have spoken here, I pulled directly from your group, Aviv. So thanks for that. Next one up, we have Kim Aviv, and Kim has been like. Really like graciously fallen into our labs also via the salons that we've been doing. She's really one of the most, I think, compassionate, fantastic communicators that we've had the pleasure to have on so far. She has like an insane bio. I really encourage you to read it. But she's worked for like a variety of different efforts, including the DoD. She's been stationed in like a host of different countries, trying to make sure that military personnel, but also national leaders, really everyone up to the Red Cross, is communicating effectively with their stakeholders. So I'm really happy. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about exactly the communication strategies around, once you have made sense of the situation, how do you communicate this effectively and to whom? And then finally, we have Phoebe Tickell, who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting in person yet. So I'm really happy to have you on here. And I just checked out your projects over the past few days a little bit. And wow, there's very little that you're not engaged in. I think if there's one maybe common thread that pulls them all together, is that you're really into experimentation as a kind of sense-making tool, and into kind of like going bit by bit or prototype by prototype into developing better systems. And I'm really happy to have you on board here. And I can't wait for your answers today. You've definitely had very high praise by I think Luz Arena and a few others that you've been collaborating with. So I'm super excited to have you on the call. So welcome to the panel. I think maybe as a way to introduce yourselves and to catch any relevant items that I may have been missing in my introduction, it would be really great if maybe we can dive into the first question. If people want to follow the questions or add to them or add new questions, please do so on Slack. The first question that we have on there that may allow you to speak a little bit about your current approach to the crisis is, how have you tried to improve informed decision-making and communication even before the crisis? And what was your role there? And how has this crisis shifted your efforts right now? And maybe we can just go down the list, and Anthony, you may want to go first.
Okay. So I would say the main thing that I've been doing is the project that Allison mentioned, Metaculus. And that started actually several years ago now. And many people will know something about it, but for those who don't, the idea is to create a sort of aggregation engine, a platform where people can post specific questions, all of which have to be very quantifiable and like precise. Is this thing going to happen or not? What number is it looking for? And then anybody can make predictions on it. The system aggregates those predictions into a single prediction of the system, and the people accrue a track record, and the system accrues a track record for accuracy and prediction. So you can start to listen to the people who made the best predictions in the past. And this, I would say, has four sort of goals to it. One is just to make the best possible predictions on like pretty much anything. So including ones that it's very difficult to have sort of a pre-existing numerical model for, or model of any sort. Second is to establish like reputation for the system as a whole and for individual people, so we know who to listen to and in what contexts. Third is, and this is a little bit abstract, but giving a meaning to probabilities, in the sense that if there's a probability that comes out of the system like 30%, that has some meaning to it, that really means that there is a context where like 30% of things like that happen. So it can be kind of grounded in something other than just this is the particular credence that some individual person gives to it. And last, and that this has become more clear to me, especially in the current COVID situation, that it's sort of a central aggregation point for people making predictions about the same thing. That, you know, there are a lot of people making a lot of predictions about a lot of things, and it's often very difficult to tell when you go into it, are they making different predictions, or are they making predictions about different things, or in a different way with a different kind of, well, it will be a different set of assumptions, but are they making a prediction about the same thing? So that project has been going for several years. It's been reasonably successful. It's a running system. Lots of, you know, thousands of questions are on it, hundreds of thousands of predictions. The COVID-19 has kind of not brought it into a higher gear, in the sense that there's been a global sense that we desperately need predictions. A pandemic is something that, you know, it's all about the prediction, in the sense that if you wait for it to be bad, then it's far too late when there's an exponential growth of something. So people have realized that things are important. They need to know, you know, actionable information about the future so that they can make decisions. And so Metaculus launched a sort of sub part of it called pandemic.metaculus.com that is focused on COVID-19, both sort of central things like case numbers and so on, but all kinds of things like, you know, timelines to vaccines, how, you know, what drugs will be efficacious, what economic effects there will be, like the whole nexus of issues. There are lots of questions on all of those. So that's been our attempt to kind of bring some central order or structure and just some reliability to the predictions about the pandemic.
Awesome, thank you so much. Yeah, I posted a link to that here if people want to follow up with that specific project. And maybe next one, if we just go down the list, Aviv, would you like to go next?
Sure. And if I recall correctly, the question is, how have you tried to improve informed decision-making and communication? Okay, now has crisis shifted your efforts? Yeah, I guess the last 5-something years specifically, though I was doing things more on the side before that, been focused on our information ecosystem and how to ensure that it doesn't essentially collapse below the level of effectiveness for sense-making, problem solving, et cetera, such that we can't sustain our present level of society or move beyond it. As in, like, we have a certain level of complexity for our society that depends on some ability, some sort of epistemic capacity, some ability to sense make. And so my original efforts on that were really focused on, well, original was really around systems thinking and sort of how do you create tools for supporting systems thinking. But that quickly shifted focus to distribution and the ways in which our distribution platforms are really sort of anti-supportive of sense making. So that's, you know, Facebook, YouTube, et al. And so really sort of pushing those organizations to be able to better address misinformation and disinformation, and sort of all the gray areas around it, in order to ideally actually incentivize better information in our overall ecosystem. And so there's a bunch of different efforts involved in that, both in terms of like proposing changes in ways that might actually get adopted, raising awareness in general, creating metrics on top of sort of what they're already doing, some of which I did at universities, like University of Michigan, where I was chief technologist of their new Center for Social Media Responsibility, and then some of which I've done sort of more independently and published about in a variety of venues. And then the last 2 or 3 years, I've also been very focused on, you know, not just distribution, but creation. And by that I mean the ways in which things like synthetic media, deepfakes, will sort of further erode or can further erode our information ecosystem. And so that's been around sort of driving awareness initially around that, because that really wasn't on the agenda for anyone. And then it's just sort of specific actions that various actors can take, whether they're researchers, platforms, et cetera. And then in terms of how the crisis has shifted my efforts, I feel like there's a few phases. So there was like February, like the end of January, early February, where I'm like really trying to figure out, to do my own sense making here, and then try to gather people to do that more effectively. So that's sort of the Facebook group that Allison brought up. And then also to try to get platforms early on to take, to sort of like, and there's a specific platform I was trying to work with to essentially elevate and incentivize content that would bring down R0. And that ended up not working. Platform at one point was like, oh, this is really just an Asia region problem. Like, let's see if we can, like, it was just wasn't very prioritized for a little while. And by the time it became a priority, everything was on fire. Was my vague impression. And that's one of the challenges of working with platforms in sort of the current form. And then there was a sort of phase in January where I was really just focused on sort of broad spectrum efforts, like what are the things we can do to just prevent the sort of like especially like early March, really just focused on how do you prevent this fallout from being really bad in the very near term. And so that's shifting from information ecosystem broadly to like, what are the things we need a sense making about the most as quickly as possible? So this is PPE reuse. We're running out of PPE all over the place. And so I sort of instigated a small team to sort of figure out what are the effective ways to do that, and then share that as broadly as possible where it's used by a number of hospital systems that we're aware of. Just so they don't have to replicate that research, which is just taking all the existing evidence-based research and sort of putting that in a form that can be used. And thankfully, a few weeks later, there was a more institutionalized effort that came in to actually do that work. But there was this 3-week lag. Then I was sick for a month and a half. And now there's a variety of different things that I'm exploring as I sort of get out of that clump to really think about what are the failures that we've been seeing, and are there ways that we can actually adjust them given our existing institutions?
Okay, wow, that is quite the list there. You've clearly done a lot, many of the things I really wasn't aware of. Okay, Kim, do you want to take a go?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure. And also I wanted to, I think you mentioned my last name was, you didn't say Osborne. It was something else. So it's Osborne. Yeah, well, that's all right. It's Osborne. Anyway, so the question though, the more important thing, how have you tried to improve informed decision-making and communication? I'll answer the first part first. And I think it depends, when I think of an answer to that, it depends on, whether I'm talking to the consumers of information or the producers of information. I've worked in, many instances where I'm an advisor to the people who are putting out the information, and then also worked as a professor and advisor to the board member to like the National Association for Media Literacy Education. And as if I'm talking about how to inform consumers to how to be more, how to improve their decision-making and communication, I would say, be a more critical consumer, learn how to check facts, get your media from reliable sources, find places that you trust to get information, and use those means to inform your decision making. Make sure that the information you're getting is either aligned with or challenging your beliefs in a way that's constructive for you, so that you can make choices and engage with the wider community in a way that's helpful and that's not hurtful to the others who are sharing the space that we are in. Because as we see especially with social media, it's the space between us that's really the most powerful. It's, we make sense by having relationships with others. And so, to be out there and contributing to the information space in a way that's ill-informed is, you know, it's only amplified by the media. And I think that's really destructive. So the way that we can be positive contributing members is to make sure that our information is good and, to the best of our ability, contribute to the information space in a way that is helpful. And, you know, there's no right answer to that. It's not like there's a recipe or a prescription, but, you know, just be smart and use best practices and, you know, work toward the greater good. I think that, you know, on the consumer side of it, then if, you know, if I'm advising a policymaker, or if I'm advising someone who has the, you know, the megaphone, someone who's in a position to be informing others, then, you know, there's also things I would say to someone who is in that, you know, more, I don't want to say powerful. I mean, they're both powerful in their different ways, but to someone who, you know, I'm just picturing someone who has that megaphone, then, you know, be proactive, not reactive to the degree you can. And that means that, you know, for instance, you have to understand how science is made. I think at one time my mom told me she was complaining about something, and it was something that I was involved in. Like I was part of the public response, and my mom either didn't know that or didn't understand that. She said, I wish they would do something. And I'm like, Mom, who do you think they is? Like, we are they. We are the ones who are making sense of this. And, you know, as someone who has worked in a university and a federal laboratory to communicate innovation and science, and, you know, I've also worked for AAAS and the National Science Foundation, like, science is an incremental thing. We don't just, you know, have the answer right away. We have to understand that, you know, the advances are made all the time, and increasing our understanding is progressive. So policymakers and, you know, those with the megaphone are also making sense along the way. And if they're doing, you know, their job good and well and right, sometimes they still don't have the answers right at the beginning. You know, most often they don't have the answers right at the beginning. So they're communicating as well as they can. I mean, then you've got some tangential kind of influences, I think, that, you know, sometimes skew things when people are trying to use opportunities like this to push forward their own agendas or to assuage their own insecurities, to, you know, take a power grab among the population. There are those kinds of things that also kind of confound this situation. But, you know, for those who are doing what is good and right and true, they are still challenged. And as consumers, we need to understand that and have some compassion and do the best we can for our own situation.
Yeah, I like that. It gives like a nice switch of lenses, I think. Phoebe, welcome.
Thank you. So good to be here. I've heard brilliant things about foresight. So yeah, really pleased to be here. So you're totally right. If you look at my website and look at the projects I've been doing, it can be hard to see the connection between them. So I'm going to start with a tiny little synthesis and then, move to talking about the present and how COVID has kind of, changed a lot of my focus right now. But so I have a kind of bizarre path, which is I started as an academic scientist, started in molecular biology, and natural sciences, had a path that I was going on to go into. I was working as a researcher at Imperial College for a couple of years in microbial genetic engineering. Actually, that's where I met John, who is here. He also works at Imperial College. Thanks to, nice to see you, John. And then from there, I left the sciences, and part of the reason actually that I decided to leave the sciences was because I saw that, in my opinion, the system of like funding and governance of science is broken. And I think that's a kind of long-term aim that I'm planning on coming back to once I do a bit more firefighting on some other stuff. But that's something I'm really passionate about. And I think it's kind of relevant to this conversation, is the kind of the way incentives in science and research work, and the way that kind of muddies that information ecology. So I think that's really interesting. But essentially I left science and took the complexity and systems view that I'd gained through working in the biological sciences and apply it to governance, education, and more recently philanthropy and narratives and communication. So those are the two areas that I work in right now. But if you look at the kind of domain areas that I've worked in, it doesn't really make sense, because I've worked in the food and farming sector, worked in technology, then went and worked in governance and like organizational design. And I think that's also relevant, because a lot of the work I've been doing around like designing resilient, like decentralized organizing systems and kind of sense making in a decentralized way is also relevant to this conversation. I'm part of a network called Inspiral, which is one of the kind of poster children of like early kind of digital decentralized organizing governance prototypes. And so, and you mentioned experimentation. So yeah, totally. I think experimentation is important. But right now, I'd say in response to COVID, so I'm working across philanthropy in the UK, and especially kind of funding community projects. So I work with the National Lottery Community Fund. My work there has been about bringing a systemic lens to how we do funding and trying to experiment, prototype a different way of doing philanthropy and funding, which follows a complexity-informed approach. So instead of having these linear ways of doing grant makings, where it's like, you will get a grant, you have to report, you have to tell us what your KPIs are going to be, what does it look like to actually fund organizations where they engage in a kind of learning program of sense making and constant iteration and relationship. So it's a very relationship centered approach. When COVID hit, I'd say basically in the last 8 weeks, I've had a kind of immediate response work that I was focusing on, and a kind of medium term response. And now I'm more in the longer term response work. The immediate term response was very much working with the lottery fund, National Lottery Community Fund, such a mouthful, but let's just call it the lottery, in trying to decide which charities and community groups most needed funding. So that was like a real experience in like sense making of a huge, it's like a 1,000 person organization, and like and very hierarchical too. So it was like, actually, how does an organization with so many layers of siloing and organizational hierarchy, which I don't have anything against, I think hierarchy can be extremely useful and necessary in complex systems too. But how do we make sense of, how do we set up a kind of sense-making network around the UK that can be kind of gathering intelligence from the ground, from community groups on the ground, and understanding as a funder, the largest community fund in the UK, how do we decide where to allocate funds and how can funding happen in more of a systemic way? So that's been really interesting. And then the longer term work that I'm doing as well as that is around narratives and how to, especially from a progressive lens, what are the narratives that are being told about the virus, and what are the kind of narratives that we're seeing emerge that we want to counter, and how can we actually counter those narratives, or what does it look like to tend to that information ecology? So that also uses a kind of complexity informed lens, but essentially the work I'm doing there, I've been funded for 3 months to be convening this global group of strategic communication experts and narrative experts in sense making around the pandemic, the metaphors and imagery and language that's being used, and coordinating a response kind of with many different partners and fostering collaboration across very different organizations and institutions to have a more coordinated and like deeper, kind of like a response that's informed by deeper thinking and deeper sense making.
Great.
Yeah, so that's it. That's all I'll say for now.
Ben, I didn't even know that you're also working on the communication angle, which is amazing. So it's really cool to have you and Kim both on that angle. So it's really nice, and I'm hoping that we'll get to the communication aspect, towards the end of it, because like basically what I would love to do is throw this question out to you now, which is, if you look at the ways in which currently we're failing at sense making in COVID-19, right? And if you have hold those obstacles, and then if you think about the next challenge that we're going to face on a global level, where do you think we're going to struggle most? And is there anything that we can put in place right now for that not to occur. So you can pick a specific one. I think, you know, on Slack I said, you know, let's pick climate change. But if you pick, like, if you actually try to like, you know, do this, like, you know, scenario of picking a challenge that you think will become majorly important for the world in the next, you know, in the next kind of like on the short horizon, and for extrapolating outward from how we failed now, if you kind of like, what do you think will be the main challenges in an upcoming crisis, and how do you think we could prepare right now to not stand there in the stunned like we currently do? Anthony, do you want to go for that first?
Okay. So to me, the most, I would say, frustrating part about the COVID-19 response has been just the total failure to think in terms of expected value, that a 10% chance of something like that is going to cost the world trillions and trillions of dollars just merits many, many billions of dollars of spending right up front, right away, as soon as you understand that there's a 10% chance of that happening. And I think that just clearly hasn't happened. Even now, it's not, you know, they're still sort of penny pinching on mitigating the crisis, and instead spending vast sums of money kind of trying to ameliorate the economic damage, which is sort of exactly backwards from, you know, the money would be much better put up front, preventing it from the whole thing from happening. So I think this stems, I think, from two aspects. One is not having the right predictions about what the possibilities of things are, like just not having access to them and not believing them. And the second is, even if you sort of have access to them and believe them, not taking them seriously, like not taking action based on them. So I think, you know, one of the thing that I spend most time with my, you know, a different hat on, the Future of Life Institute hat, we're worried somewhat about pandemics, but we've spent a lot more effort on AI and thinking about the dangers inherent in like transformative AI. The situation seems very likely to be similar there, in the sense that any sort of argument that there's a, you know, 5% or a 1% or a 0.1% chance of something really terrible happening will just be swept under the rug as, well, that's a small probability, so I'm not going to worry about it, even though the impact is huge. And that the only, you know, people will wait to react to any sort of concern about that for the concern to be like present and in their face and causing damage. And as with the pandemic, if you wait until it's present and in your face and causing damage and a big problem, that's way too late. So I think that's the failure that I see, and that's the failure that I worry about most in whatever the next catastrophe is. It probably won't be a pandemic, it might be, but you know, we'll have a tendency to solve this problem, you know, to prevent this exact thing from happening again. This probably will not be the next major problem that occurs to the world. But it's likely that the same sort of inabilities to act will happen. So that's my concern. And I think there are various ways that we might act to try to increase people's ability to think in terms of expected value, or just, you know, rationally, frankly, you know, making decisions that are based on like rational decision-making, quantitative decision-making. It's just not really happening at the moment.
So what's like a specific way in which one could address this? Do you mean like a future keys style based governance, or like, you know, really like using Metaculus as a policy tool?
I mean, I think the organizations that are, I think there probably will be multiple organizations that are set up to think about the next pandemic. I'm hoping that some of those, that organizations like that could be given a broader charter to think about the next set of problems that are happening in general. Those organizations, I think, should be, you know, explicitly making use of quantitative forecasting and thinking about, you know, issuing genuine probabilities for things, and making public statements to the effect that this is the expected cost of this thing happening, this is the probability of it happening, this is the expected, you know, this is the cost, this is the probability, this is the expected cost, we should be doing at least some small fraction of that in terms of our effort. So bringing that in public statements to, not just inside closed rooms, but saying those sorts of things out loud. This is the expected cost of this sort of occurrence. And I think, so I would try to affect that. I suspect there will be both private and public organizations coming into being a little bit more firmly because of this crisis. And they'll have some attention for at least a short time. So I think a good target would be to influence how those organizations are put together and how they operate in that sort of way.
All right, neat. Maybe, Metaculus is already up and running. Why not extend it to have that same capacity too? Aviv, what's kind of like your future predicted global challenge, and how can we kind of like use how we failed in this one to inform a better response to the next one?
So before I answer that, I just wanted to just chime into the thing that was just spoken about. I think there's this very interesting opportunity to, essentially to build credibility for such systems now. So there's still a lot of dominoes that have not fallen yet in various ways, but may fall societally. And I think it's interesting to think about, is it possible to pick a specific set of sort of curated predictions, make them very, very use all the megaphones at one's disposal to be clear, here's how those predictions were created, here's the expected costs and so on of those things. And I'd be curious, maybe that this will be a later conversation, but if that type of action is happening now in order to help sort of create that momentum to be like, oh, this is a thing that we can do, as opposed to like when I go to Metaculus.com, right, you see a lot of stuff and you have no idea what to think. And I think that that's really useful if you're trying to actually use it, but it's not useful if you're sort of trying to get that sort of credibility long-term and sort of snowball that. So I'm excited about that possibility. But yeah, in terms of the question that you asked, I had a list of ways in which information ecosystem collapse could make it very difficult to deal with other major issues, and of course, pandemic was on that list. I'm not gonna, but I wouldn't have guessed necessarily that was the top of the list, right? Because that isn't that to me, that almost is like, what exactly is going to be the forcing function that brings us into some worst state, and maybe has some cascades, isn't the thing that I think about the most. It's more about how do we, what are the actual failures of those systems that ensure that we will be able to break out of that we'll be able to address whatever challenge, like we're going to be adaptive. And so for me, it's still the continued breakdown of our sort of adaptive response. And what we're talking here is, it's not just a sense-making component, but it's the ability to execute on that, the ability to communicate about that sense-making. All of those things are continuing to deteriorate from my perspective. I don't know that we're really getting better at them. And for me, this sort of crisis of like individual understanding and the ways in which any individual does not have an environment around them that supports their ability to make sense of the world, that to me is still the, I see that as being fundamental, and then everything else to sort of being like cascading threat multipliers, if you want to, throw some terminology at that.
So on an individual level, what would you recommend people do right now to kind of like move themselves into a better epistemic environment? So,
I think this is sort of like saying, well, yeah, on an individual level, what would you do to move yourself into a better environment, right? Well, spaceships aren't really cheap, and actually, the Earth is still the most habitable place on Earth. In the galaxy, the universe that we know of. It's important that any individual has a good environment, but it isn't something that any individual can directly influence overly much, because they're stuck within their sort of network of people who all have their own beliefs, and those beliefs influence their beliefs, and they can't move too far outside of that without suffering severe consequences. So it's really, how do you build those systems so that the likelihood that you're going to engage with information because of the distribution systems, and because of the the mechanisms by which you create information. The likelihood that that information is higher is going to increase your understanding of the world as opposed to decrease it. You want to improve that, and that's a property of a variety of everything from the incentives on news organizations to the algorithmic like the algorithmic design choices to the actual product design choices created by platforms, and then all of those sort of they all interlink. Like if your product design like emphasizes particular things, then your news organization is going to do particular things to some extent. And so I see there being a lot of like many small changes that you can make across all of these different systems that then affect this sort of flow of knowledge to everyone. That said, there are things that individuals can do. Was it?
Yeah. Do you have a laundry list of specific things individuals can do?
Well, okay. So I mean, the specific thing an individual can do, if you're like not trying to push for systemic change, is that, I mean, most people don't have sort of knowledge about how to. It's like most people, you put them on Facebook or put them on the internet, and it's like giving someone a car. And that's really great. Giving someone a car is a wonderful thing to do. They now have all this freedom that they didn't have before, all this capability they didn't have before. But if you don't teach them how to drive, you don't teach them the rules of the road, right? They're going to hurt themselves and they're going to hurt others. And so we need to actually teach people how to navigate the information that we're giving them access to in ways that don't hurt themselves and don't hurt others. And the basic versions, if you think about, you're looking for information, you're trying to figure out if something is true or false, you're searching online. If you don't know how to do like Command F or Control F on your computer to search a site to find the thing that you're looking for to see if it's true or false, you've got to read the entire page to do so. Your ability to make sense of the world goes down dramatically. And people don't know how to do that. They don't know how to search on a page. And so that's like the level of web literacy that we don't have in the world. And that's just even don't have even in the United States. Like these are things that college students don't know how to do.
Yeah, maybe you can share in the chat like a little bit about like specific avenues that you recommend people go into. That would be amazing.
Yeah. And these are not applicable to our audience, but they're applicable to the sort of the broader environment.
Yeah, and that would be useful for us to share too. Okay, Kim, I would be really interested to hear specifically from you about like, you know, what were communication failures now and how could we kind of like, what are general good practices about communicating if we have to do that for the next global crisis?
Yeah, I really like this question when you asked it, because the way it was asked, you know, particularly with that reference to climate change made me think of, you know, like day trading on the stock market. And, you know, like what is the next crisis going to be? Is it going to be climate change? Is it going to be, you know, oil? Is it going to be water scarcity? And, you know, I think I told you before, like when I'm working with the Red Cross, we have the saying that, you know, if you responded to one disaster, you've responded to one disaster. You don't, you know, I'm a disaster responder with the Red Cross, but, you know, having worked in Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Michael doesn't mean that I know the right way to respond to, you know, the wildfires in California. And then, you know, in the Army, we say that, you know, we've prepared ourselves for the last war, for the previous war. So we take our lessons from, you know, the experience we've just gone through, and then something new comes up, and then we're forced to react to that. So in that way, I think it's kind of, I mean, the more happy side of me, what's the word I'm thinking of, you know, the more progressive side of me says, this is what we need in order to create progress, like that. We get this challenge to our assumptions, and then we have to adjust our assumptions. And so, you know, to Aviv's point, like we can respond as individuals, and we do respond as individuals, but the environment changes with our response. Like it's not a static, you know, that we respond and the environment is what it is. To the second part of his point, we do absolutely have to be informed, and, you know, and when we play a part in that environment, and, you know, like the proverbial drop of water in the ocean, we are part of that system. So as we change, the system changes as well. And so I think, you know, how can we, what's the second part of the system? How can we, you know, make ourselves more, better prepared for the next disaster or crisis. Well, you know, to the point that was made earlier, we can respond by becoming more resilient. We can respond by becoming, you know, better informed and knowing about how this environment that we're in works to the degree that it does in that moment. You know, it's going to change, and we have to change too. We each adapt, and it's like these systems are working together and changing as a result of their relationship with each other. So even recognizing that is a kind of resilience. It's, you know, don't be upset when the answer you gave last time isn't going to work this time, because things have changed, and that's okay. Like, how do we build a certain amount of, you know, malleableness in our own responses so that whatever happens, whether it's, you know, water insecurity or energy or whatever, that we know that we are okay, that we can adapt, and that the, you know, that the environment and our relationship to it are a negotiated prospect, and then, you know, we'll be able to handle anything. And it's going to be challenging, but it's supposed to be. Like, that's what comes with novelty. So, you know, there's no right answer. I don't think there's like, you know, there's not once again, there's not a prescription, but just help, you know, lets us build our own resiliency and our own, you know, tool belt so that we can handle anything that comes along.
All right, thank you. Yeah, again, quite like, I think, an optimistic take on, you know, maybe it's okay if we're wrong, and if it's almost like the last question is like pushing us to progress, and at least we're progressing like a little bit, rather than you know, being kind of like prepared for all hosts of crises. And okay, well, Phoebe, I can't see you, but if you want to mute yourself and tackle that question, it would be great.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think it's really good. I was just thinking when it said, what future global challenges do you wish to be prepared for now? Choose one. And I was just like, basically like future human existence is actually the challenge of actually, you know, like there's many smaller challenges within that, but essentially, you know, like looking at existential risk feels to me like the challenge. But that's a little bit cheating. The immediate thing the thing I've been thinking a lot about is actually, what if this pandemic had happened with an Ebola kind of virus, like a virus that had a far higher death rate, and like unbelievable, like the implications of that. Like, I've been so shocked at the lack of systemic preparedness to this virus. And it's not been a failure of foresight. It's been a failure of acting on prediction. So that to me is really interesting. It's like, we've seen this coming for years. You can find the academic papers in 2007, 2008. They're saying, you know, a COVID strain of virus is coming like in the next 10 years. You know, like there was a lot of prediction. And then to see, I think it was on March 9th, an article, you know, and like my contacts in the NHS and in the medical field of the UK, you know, PPE was running out. Like, nurses didn't have access to masks. Like, it's completely, we could have been absolutely prepared for that. So there's something around that of long-term thinking, like having governments are wired to engage in short-term thinking with this 4-year cycle, and it's leaving us completely woefully unprepared for existential level risks. So that's one piece of what I think we need to kind of focus on. And so it's a combination of kind of incentives problem and long-term thinking. The other thing, like once the virus has hit, what I'm seeing is like the massive problem around the information ecology, like the pollution of that. And I was kind of mulling on that the other day and thinking that, you know, the people who so people are looking to experts, and a lot of these experts have power, or, you know, politicians or scientists, but there's a incentives problem there. So their incentives are not always to put out the kind of purest truth and information. There's a kind of power problem there, or like a corruption problem. But then people who, let's say citizens or you know, less well-known scientists or people with less access to power have a resource problem of like, then they don't have the resources to go through the same kind of peer review process or have access to like the research networks and that sort of thing. So I see there being a kind of power resource problem. And the other, and part of that is also just, I mean, I've said before, I think this virus is forcing us into systemic thinking. It's forcing us into systems thinking. It's like actually a lot, like we don't teach systems thinking in schools. And so a lot of my work in the last years have been around running trainings for people and leaders and decision makers on how to actually foster and practice and kind of cultivate complexity informed and systemic thinking, because we have actually gone through education systems, professional career paths that have selected for the opposite, selected for reductionist, linear ways of thinking, and that's leaving us pretty blind to these to the ripple effects of the virus, of like all of the second order and third order effects, and the ability to actually effectively strategize and like model potential further impacts. The last thing I wanted to say is I'd say the first part of the question was, looking ahead, trying to remember failures in a default sense-making systems, communication systems. I think the kind of siloedness of like institutions, of say scientists or politicians, like I looking to the future, I'm really interested in how can we set up like infrastructure for cross-disciplinary, cross-institutional sense-making that allows basically all of these like researchers and policymakers and people who can kind of make decisions and have power to influence what happens. Like how are they're not speaking essentially? So how can we create these kind of uninstitutions or like informal sense-making networks and be able to actually have people like scientists trained in collaboration, trained in the ability to organize in decentralized ways. Like I think there's a huge amount of work to do in the next kind of 10 years.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely resonate with you on like, especially I think I used to do like deep analysis and scenario planning for like a previous employer of like 2030 outwards, and then kind of like going along the economy and like society, technology, politics, economics and ecology. And it was kind of insane to see how many factors there were and how little people kind of like are familiar with different tools of thinking a little bit more like qualitatively, and how much aversion against there actually is. But I think, it definitely just allows you to see many different factors that could be influencing a certain topic. Okay, great. So Jonathan had a question, and Jonathan, I'm going to find you and unmute you. And I would love if the panelists could find a way in which we can actually make the answer to this wrapped into your final words that you want to give to participants. Please make it succinct, maybe like a minute each or something would be amazing. Okay, Jonathan.
Awesome. Yeah, am I unmuted? Yep. I'm just interested and curious how it would look, how adoption would look from larger institutions to adopt some of these sense-making tools. And I know we're speaking a lot about the need for newer institutions and prototyping and having various different experiments going on, but the existing institutions, how would it look like for them to adopt a lot of these better sense-making technologies and tools?
Anyone, go for it.
I could jump in with my minute. I'd say it's already happening. I've been super impressed at the response, at least with my UK view, that, for example, Dave Snowden is a well-known complexity thinker and researcher, and he's developed a great tool called SenseMaker, which is like an app or like an online platform that collects and aggregates qualitative data, but then analyzes it quantitatively of opinions, storytelling, and narratives. And like, there's a real surge that I'm seeing in response to the virus of, institutions that a month ago or 2 months ago would never have been talking about sense making and complexity and like the need for those approaches and ways of thinking. So that's my minute. Is like, I'm feeling quite hopeful. And with some existential hope.
Great. Please share some of those in the chat. It would be awesome to collate them. Okay, Kim, do you want to go?
Yeah, Thanks for that question. And I agree with Phoebe. I think it's already happening. I work primarily with very large institutions, you know, the American Red Cross, the US Army. I gave a talk at the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in 2016 about how best practices from the corporate world can be used to inform military and diplomatic conversations about large-scale crises. And so, you know, I think some of these examples they're already being implemented, and no one, I don't think anyone has a monopoly on good ideas. So that the ideas are coming from, you know, large organizations or small organizations. I think they all can be adopted by anyone, and they already are. Like, there are people who are advisors like me who are looking across the spectrum, not just at different kinds of organizations, different sizes of organizations, but, you know, groups like Foresight are bringing together people from all these disparate perspectives so that we can have these conversations. And then those of us who do form these, participate in these mediator kind of roles can share best practices. So, I mean, that's one way to do it, and it's already happening. Like I said, this, you know, there are no individual participants, there are participants in an environment, and both change as each of them changes. So it's a negotiated reality, and it's happening.
So,
thank you. Yeah, Aviv?
Yeah, I'm going to throw in the much more pessimistic take, which is that I see us as not like there are movements in those directions, but in terms of like the broader public, at least in places like the US, I mean, you have 19% of people, according to a recent YouGov survey, saying they do not want to get back the vaccine when it is available, right? 26% say they're not sure, right? So you have numbers like that, and you're like, regardless of how good the sense making is in terms of these institutions, they've lost they've lost the game. They're almost irrelevant to these large populations. And so I see like one of the most important things that needs to happen is ensuring that there are ways of taking the information that's even coming out of the sense making that these institutions are doing that is good, and as you know, I mean, sort of like Kim's work, sort of taking that and bringing that into the public and being able to address it quickly in the same way that Phoebe is just describing, so that these narratives don't take hold, especially ones that are completely incongruous with the actual sense making that we already are doing effectively, which is like vaccines can be helpful.
All right, thanks. Anthony?
Yeah, this is a question that bothers me a lot, because I think there are a lot of tools, and if organizations really want to think effectively, say about probabilities or predictions or any of these things, they sort of can, but there seem to be some institutional incentives against it. And I think there's a long history of prediction markets and prediction platforms and things that just don't get a lot of uptake because the structure that like corporations and other organizations have, it just doesn't fit neatly into. There aren't people chomping at the bit for accurate like numerical predictions about things, even though they totally should be. Like, everybody knows that those are useful for, like, who thinks about it knows that those are useful for making good decisions. Why aren't people trying harder to get those things? So I think there must be like, and you can think of some of them, the incentives against it, but how do we make incentives for that to happen? And I'm not sure, but I think it's worth thinking about, like, are there methods through insurance somehow, or like requiring certain organizations to get insurance in a way that will make them think about some of these failure modes more? Or is it something like try to make it more explicitly known to stockholders and companies what are the potential dangers to that company, what are its vulnerabilities in terms of things that could go wrong that they should be worried about, and maybe if they aren't, that should devalue the stock somewhat. I'm not sure what the right ways to create those incentives are, but I feel like until we do, organizations will just go about the way that they do with their kind of internal human dynamics, generated as they are, and it will be hard to have a huge influence on how organizations run until we create those incentives. They should happen automatically, but they just seem to not.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think Robin Hanson wrote about this in the book of like, why don't people, an elephant in the brain, why don't people use predictions, to make better forecasts? And I think, the incentive is like, then they are being held accountable if, if they make wrong predictions as well, right? So that's uncomfortable. And, currently there's always, when people make statements, there's always some wishy-washy way in which they could say, no, actually I predict this, or, so I think accountability is the big one here.
I mean, so if I've thrown one anecdote there, I spent a while trying to get some top-tier economists to chime in on the sort of the impact on the economy of not continuing, or like not either increasing or continuing lockdowns in various areas. And the response I was getting was basically, we can't, like, no one legitimate is willing to put their perspective behind some set of numbers because of a variety of like incentive issues. Even though that would have been very, very useful in terms of shifting the debate from economy versus lives, if you could say economy and lives, at least in some areas.
All right, thank you so much. Hey, I really thank you all for staying on 4 minutes too long. I hope it was useful to you. I think like we barely scratched the surface. There's so many different tools, that we'd love to point out. FHI has a fantastic epidemic forecasting tool as well. I'm hoping that we can all get on Slack and collect those tools, and to maybe like, give other people the chance to contribute and to share those with others as well. The cool thing that I think Anthony always points out is that the more people contribute, actually the wisdom of the crowds just gets better. So there's definitely something to be said for having more people do this. I want to thank the panel for coming on today. Thank you so much. It was really fantastic. I think Lou is going to take over now with some participant sharing. I hope to see many of you on Slack to be collecting more. And I just want to say, I think Steve, if you're still here, happy birthday. Our president has birthday today. So happy birthday from everyone. We love you, Steve. All right, everyone, for whoever would like to stay on and share, please do so. And thank you so much to all participants and panelists for staying on.